This is the Instant Speed Podcast, brought to you by Fabdb.net, your premier source for deck building tools, collection management, and simulated booster drafting. Upgrade your account at Fabdb.net. Get access to all the features, bring your game to the next level. Yes, this is the Instant Speed Podcast, episode 25. Our guest today will be Bryan Gottlieb. Yeah, you remember him from the casting at The Calling in Indianapolis alongside Tan and Grace and myself. It's going to be a great conversation. We have lots to do, but we also skipped a week because we were traveling for a bit, so we got to catch up on some news. We're bringing you the facts. Yes, Calling Indianapolis. It happened. It was amazing. Probably one of the best tournaments I've ever been involved with. The winner was Michael Hamilton, taking home his second Calling win. He was playing Bravo, star of the show, and there is an interview that I had with Michael that's available here on 983 Media and on your podcast. It was a nice conversation that I had with the champ about that win and the meta, whole bunch of things. How about new heroes? Well, it's been leaked. Yorick, the Weaver of Tales, is the new hero of a new class. The Bard class has been released, and take a look at this bad boy. Yorick, the Weaver of Tales, is going to stir some significant emotions at the table when you're playing with him. So have a good look at Yorick, the newest hero revealed by LSS. Skirmish season is underway between March 26th all the way through till April 17th. Get your Skirmish action going at your local game store. I'm sure you can find on fabtcg.com, you can find some event locators to see where skirmishes are happening in your area. The prizes are pretty sweet. Take a look at these bad boys. The prizes, lots of cold foil, young heroes, playmats, the whole 9 yards. Great stuff. If you want to elevate your game, get ready for Skirmish season. I wrote an article on fabtcg.com revolving around basically exactly that. Have a good look. Are you wanting to win some of these tournaments? Do you want to go from casual to competitive? Check out this article to elevate your game. I also want to talk briefly about an awesome crew of individuals that I met over ProQuest season, because I met them at the ProQuest at Red Riot Games in Mississauga. And they are sponsored by a store called Cardcaster. And these four dudes are really awesome. They won several ProQuests amongst all of them. And I want to give them the respect that they're due. Alexandre Lefebvre, Michel Corvino, Carl Del Ducetto, and Nicolas Plouffe. You guys are awesome. It was awesome to hang out with you guys over the weekends of ProQuest. Multiple PQ wins amongst this team. And finally, I want to give a big shout out to our patrons here on the show. I know this has been a long news segment, but we did skip a week, so bear with me here because these people are absolute pros. We do have a Patreon, and it helps support the show. If you like what happens here on the Instant Speed Podcast, you can support the show on various different tiers. We do not hide any content behind paywalls, but if you do want to support us, get a little few extra perks along the way, you can do so, such as these patrons, such as Go Again Gaming, Fab TCG Cards, The Tiger's Den, Andy T, and Mitch L, and our Tier 2, our associate producer tier, who get Go Again question priority and are entered in our BCW supplies swag draw at the end of every month. We've got Tom R, Alaric C, and Roger. So you guys, thank you so much for supporting the show. We've got Bryan Gottlieb here on the Instant Speed Podcast, and he is bringing the heat. So enjoy it. Thank you so much. Here we go. It is time to switch gears, ladies and gentlemen, as we are knee-deep in Skirmish season. Yes, classic constructed, thing of the past, time to get funky with Blitz. So head on over to Fabdb.net, upgrade your account to premium, get access to all of those tools. Now, honestly, there's a lot of decks that are already out there on Fabdb that you can go ahead and browse and maybe get a good look at, but how about you want to build your own? Well, you can do so. Go to Fabdb.net, upgrade that account, have access to all the deck building tools that you'll ever need, including breakdown of the statistics, the pitch distribution, and all that jam. You can go ahead and export your list for easy deck printing. Go to fabdb.net, upgrade your account, have access to the best collection management tools, and all your deck building goodness. Fabdb.net. You will not regret it. The Instant Speed Podcast welcomes a true professional in the broadcast realm of card games, ladies and gentlemen. He was most recently seen casting alongside Tan and Grace and some clown, aka myself, at the Calling in Indianapolis. His latest article that he has written delves into the gray areas surrounding the exchange of Pro Tour invites. welcome to the show, Mr. Bryan Gottlieb. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you, sir. It is my absolute pleasure to sit down and chat with you again. I was worried that we were going to be a one and done team up. You know, you were there under odd circumstances. I don't have any other Fab gigs on my calendar as it stands right now, but you came through. You made it happen where we could spend some time together again and chat more flesh and blood.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, given the circumstances as they were unfortunate, to say the least. I feel bad for Craig. I've never met Craig. I hear incredible things about Craig. I know that you and him have worked together before, and he's an upstanding human being and citizen of the world. And again, the circumstances were what they were. There's nothing else. But I got the call late in the 11th hour, and I was very happy to go up to bat for Craig. And I think that we did a great job and did his legacy justice. I
agree, and to be able to step up on such short notice like that, you deserve all the credit in the world. It was, I got to take time, practice the things I wasn't super sure about, smooth out any rough edges. You get the call at the last second, and you just have to be on your game, and you just delivered to the nth degree. I can't sing your praises enough.
Well, I appreciate it again, and coming from someone like yourself, a professional. It was good that there was at least there was one professional that I could work with there. Again,
you keep throwing around this P word. I don't know if I actually earn it. Like, I just kind of show up and say a bunch of words, and people seem to enjoy it. If that makes me a professional, so be it. But
it's fascinating, right? The level in which that we get certain levels of respect or admiration because of what we do. Also, that was my one dig at Tan and Grace. There has to be a one dig at Tan and Grace per episode. That was my dig at Tan and Grace.
I'm saving mine for later.
Perfect. Ooh, that's a segment 3 type of dig. We'll throw that one later. So as we do with every new guest on the show who has never been on the show, this is episode 25. Where have you been, first of all, for 24 previous episodes, Mr. Bryan? But we got to hear your origin story. I know that you've made waves within the CCG realm and the landscape for many years, but for those who maybe do not know you, why don't you talk a little bit about where you began your CCG journey all the way to where you are today, being a very prominent pillar of the CCG community across various different titles.
Yeah, I'm mostly a Magic guy. I played Magic from 1990. I always get confused whether it's 94 or 95. I think it's 94. Till the present day, still playing Magic, still making content around it. That's where I first did my broadcasting thing. It's where I have other background stuff that informs my writing. But, for as far as TCG goes, did a bunch of Magic writing, have had a podcast called the Arena Deck List Podcast for some large number of years now. I think we're going on 4 years or so. So just very in the content creation game in that space. And while my focus has always been on Magic, I've also basically played every TCG that has come out. I just love the genre. I always have. So, you name it, I've probably at least dabbled in it, going all the way back to the early horrible games that just tried to cash in on the boom that Magic created, to the ones that, were pretty good along the way and just didn't quite make it. I've dabbled in them all. But I will tell you, Flake, I have never actually amassed a huge collection, nor played a tournament in anything other than Magic. That was it. That was the only game that hooked me that deeply until I tried Flesh and Blood.
For somebody who says that they've played so many different titles and goes as far back as as I do, into the 90s in terms of what card gaming was, and I am fully aware of those types of titles that kind of try to cash in, because I have seen packs of Austin Powers TCG and other kinds of nonsense of that degree. I have to ask you what the most obscure one is, and then I'll let you finish your origin story here. But I wanted to just slide in here and say that I've played some very weird and obscure ones, but there's a lot that I'd just be like, no, this is clearly a gimmick. I'm not even going to dip my toe in this pool. But I want to know what Bryan Gottlieb's most ridiculous title that he tried out was.
Maybe Gridiron, the football TCG. Not even one of the NFL ones, because I know there became licensed ones later, but this was just a made up football game. And the best card in the game was called Scoreboard Commandos. And what I actually think it let you do is once per half change score totals with your opponent. So you just got to steal their score.
This is like like those like video games that don't have licensing, so they make up very similar like players and titles and stat lines for stuff.
Yep.
That's awesome. I'm sorry. It reminds me of like MLB Showdown, which was the baseball game, but this one had no licensing agreement. All right.
No licensing. I think it predated MLB Showdown because I remember that too. But it was like very much in that first run of TCGs. At that time, I was playing Magic. I remember playing a bunch of Rage, the werewolf TCG, which I went back and like I remember liking a bunch as a kid, and I went back and like looked at the rules, and I'm like, this is barely a game. I don't even understand how this works. And yeah, so there was that one. Wyvern, certainly Star Trek, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Legend of the Five Rings. I mean, like I literally tried all of them.
And then you've essentially made your way now to Flesh and Blood, and that is where we stand today. Obviously, you still have, a foot in many different arenas, as it were, but Flesh and Blood to you right now is one that you're very prominent in, that you've made a splash in as well. Indianapolis was an exceptional event, but I have to ask you right now, how did you first become introduced to Flesh and Blood, and what was that first hook that essentially reeled you in to, basically separate Flesh and Blood from Gridiron or Wyvern or all those others that may seem like flashes in the pan?
Well, it's weird because Flesh and Blood was like in my periphery. I wasn't playing it, but I was hearing buzz. And that's because there was a lot of Magic folks who were involved. Like they were publishing content over on Channel Fireball, which I knew as a Magic site. The professor from Tolarian Community College did like a how to play video. So the stuff keeps popping into my periphery very briefly and then disappears. And I'm hearing this talk, but I don't know anyone who actually plays the game. I'm like, is this a real thing or is this just like a total scam? Because I haven't met anyone who plays Flesh and Blood. And then I'm still at that point when the Pro Tour announcement hits. And I'm like, all right, look, if they're putting this much effort into having an organized play, I have to at least do some due diligence and see what they're doing here, see if this is actually a game worth playing. And I went to my LGS. I bought the Monarch Blitz decks and got together with my brother, and we played some games. And within about, I would say 45 minutes, I was like, oh, this is legit. Like this is not a clone. This is not a cash-in. This is not any of those type of things. This is a thoughtful, well-designed TCG that is trying to do something not only different but exciting. Like they weren't content with just doing what every other TCG has done before them. They were trying some new ideas, some new just entire game flows. Like the entire basis of Flesh and Blood being a game where you power down as the game goes on. That's so contrary to just standards of game design and how so many other TCGs are. So it really stood out to me as something special. From that point, it was just like, learn everything I can, digest everything I can, and it has only revealed more depth to me. It's only gotten better as I've explored deeper and deeper.
That's the fascinating element to me as well, is that you think that eventually you're going to hit this bedrock of where the game basically bottoms out, and you're thinking, okay, the more I dig in, eventually I'm going to run out of layers to peel back, and be it, certain heroes, maybe that's the case. They're overplayed, or they're so popular that eventually there's not many more elements that you can discover in terms of what this hero can do. But the game as a whole, I find that despite the fact that it is being played by incredibly smart, adept players, and it just seems like there's constantly new variations, there's constantly new layers that are being pulled back to reveal just how deep, like you mentioned, this game can be. And on first play, I was thinking like, okay, it's a life total game. Instead of creatures on the board, it's attacks out of hand, and they're not existing on the board as permanents, as it were. So I see how this game can differ. But the more and more that I got into it, like you mentioned, everybody has their first interaction with the game, but eventually you come to a point where you have that realization, that click. And for you, it was within the first 45 minutes. For myself, it was the same deal. It was that first major game I played where a straightforward decision that seems obvious is not as obvious as it looks. And repercussions late game are relevant, and that's one aspect of Flesh and Blood that I really I really like. And I'm curious also to get your quick opinion on this in terms of, is this game, how much deeper is there, do you feel, to this game, or have we reached the pinnacle where it's very deep, but we finally, our feet have hit the ground on this?
I don't think we're close. Like, I think even in terms of like the best players, they're still finding new heuristics and finding new ways to approach the game. And what was common wisdom is always being challenged. And the thing about TCGs, that I look at a TCG as a language. I think when you form your TCG, you're not actually just making a game. You're making the core language that is going to be used to tell future stories. And a lot of people don't leave enough room in their language to express mechanics with accuracy and vigor, and make things actually feel like what they're trying to represent. I always go to Pokemon. I think the Pokemon game is like, the Pokemon TCG is fine. I don't really have any objection to it. I enjoy playing it from time to time. No part of it, though, feels like a Pokemon to me. Like, there's no throwing my Pokeball onto the field and then engaging in the battle. It just all feels like very mechanical and crunchy, whereas Flesh and Blood expresses its ideas so well, and the core of Flesh and Blood is going to allow the game to express whatever ideas it wants. It's only limited by the designer's creativity, and whatever you want to, whatever story you want to tell through Flesh and Blood, whatever gameplay experience you want to present, I believe there's space to do it with the rule set.
So what you mentioned about the fact that the players haven't even, dipped their toe anywhere close to the bottom of this pool is fascinating to me, because a lot of the players that we've spoken to on this podcast or have had discussions with privately, at the venue in Indianapolis, is the common consensus here from the top players in the world is that the overall skill level of the competitive field has essentially, everybody's raised their game. This tide has essentially lifted all ships, and if you've basically just lagged behind, if you've stopped to smell the roses, you've been lapped by the field to a degree. There's no taking time off, because it's this constant ramp up. You've never throttled down, as it were, and the field is just so much better. And I want to get your thoughts about just the level of competition of from when you got into the game, because I think you said you got in around Monarch, which is the same time that I got into it and playing events and whatnot. And my first foray into competitive, really decent tournaments of bigger stakes tournaments were like the Road to National season, where I saw what that level of players were, and finishing 4-2 at a tournament and seeing what the best players were doing and playing. That compared to a ProQuest, 6 months later, was night and day. And seeing the level of play at these tournaments was also night and day. What is your assessment of that level of competition from when you first were aware of it to where it is today?
Yeah, like you said, night and day. My first event was at SCG Con shortly after the release of Tales of Aria, and I played limited PTQ. And I think I did like a sealed with like no stakes earlier in the con, and did pretty well, and then played the PTQ, which is the first like real stakes event I was playing, where people were like enforcing the rules and like not just there to have a good time. And I finished in the top 4. It was my first ever draft when I drafted in the top 8. And over the course of that tournament, I'm not saying like this is true of the field, because obviously I didn't play everyone in the field, but I felt like I played one player who was more knowledgeable than myself. And I had been like, 3 weeks into the game at this point. But I was able to leverage all of my other TCG background and put it to work in Flesh and Blood very quickly. And I felt like I had a huge edge over the field, despite the fact that I had not been playing long, with 1 or 2 exceptions. That would not fly today. I mean, just in the ProQuest season, everyone I played was, if at least competent, if not very good. And it's just evolved so quickly to where players understand what the goals are of gameplay. There was a lot of just like, here are my cards and let's see what they do. And it's very quickly getting to the point where it's skilled, thoughtful players, not only at the level of like the Calling and certainly what we're going to see at the Pro Tour, but even in local scenes, the players have just gotten so much better.
the decks, much like what Chain were prior to the Seeds of Agony ban and the Plunder Run ban, and that how Chain essentially seems to be very resilient. Chain used to be, in my opinion, one of the higher skill ceiling types of decks in terms of how to operate it properly, how to set up your pitch for late game, explosion, as it were, and late game threat, and finding that lethal when it matters. And now it seems that more and more of these heroes are coming through with that kind of, you need that prowess. It's not just about being good at cards in general. It's about being good at this particular card game, this particular hero. If you're a Viserai player, there's very few elements that you can take from being a good Viserai player to being a good Prism player, as it were. So many more decks are finding that you need that 1% edge. You need to practice hours into understanding instant speed, resolution, or finding those windows to be better. And I've just named a few of those heroes. Starvo is a completely different one, but ultimately Starvo is the third vertice in this triangle of doom that has essentially dominated the Calling in Indianapolis. And as a caster, I mean, you and I can oftentimes commiserate how difficult it is to put something intriguing on the screen when you're looking for a new hero, a new matchup, a new narrative. How challenging was it when it became the third or fourth Starvo versus Vis or Starvo versus Prism matchup? How difficult was it to just maintain some kind of interest in terms of making sure that the audience knew that this particular matchup is going to taste a little bit different than the previous three that we've had?
I will tell you this. I didn't fake anything throughout the broadcast. I was legitimately intrigued by every match we covered, and there's so many small wrinkles in Flesh and Blood that matter so much. Like, you just go to Michael Hamilton and his winning Starvo list. How much was there to talk about in the differences between Michael Hamilton's list and everyone else's list, and just the way he approached games? Like, he wasn't playing the games the same as other people, and these things constantly revealed themselves throughout the day. So even when we started to get to that very top of the metagame and we were dealing with lots of Prisms, lots of Starvos, there were still so many interesting matches to cover, to say nothing of the fact that, like, there was rogue success in that field. And I don't think we sat there and presented just the same decks over and over. And having covered Magic tournaments in the past where you just had to do that, like, there was nothing else. If you wanted good players, you were only covering these decks. That was not the case when it came to Indianapolis, even when the tournament shook out in the end to 4 Starvos, 2 Prisms, and 2 Dark Horses. The entire path there was ripe with decks that could have broken into the top 8, that were certainly close. And I'm not denying anything about the metagame. I think Starvo's the best deck by a lot. I think Prism's the second best deck, and that is clear to me. But there's still points of interest throughout it, and it was a very, very easy event to cover because it remained so fascinating throughout.
We looked at those deck lists, like you mentioned, the Michael Hamilton deck list, then you and I covering the finals there. It was such a fascinating way to just peruse over it. And just what we typically do, for those who aren't aware, is that right before the matches are happening, and we're choosing what match to feature, which oftentimes is not even a choice for us. It's just like, this is obviously the one we're going to show. But we get the deck list for these players, and we usually just circle some very intriguing or points of interest on those deck lists of particular cards that are going to be impactful, that we're going to see that might be unorthodox. And when we're looking at Michael Hamilton's list, I think that you and I circled probably about 8 or 9 different cards or pools of cards and saying, okay, this is different, or this is different, or note that there's no this, or note that there's no this. There was so many elements of that particular deck list that we pulled out of there as points of discussion that we didn't even get to talk about prior to the matchup because there were so many. And that's what's fascinating, and I think is also great about this game, is that even within that hero, there's no right way to build a hero. There are multiple right ways to, and Michael Hamilton really hammered that home by saying, all right, all of you out there who are really banking on things like Awakening and Pulverize and blah, 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 no problem. Here's my list, and here's how I'm going to play it. And oh, by the way, I've won a Calling, and I'm going to win this one too. So that level of confidence and understanding and discipline to the game plan really enhanced the experience, in my opinion.
I love that you said the word game plan, because that's what Flesh and Blood is about. It's about game planning. And if your game plan is to play a matchup a certain way, then cards have relative value based on how you were playing a matchup. It doesn't matter that Awakening is a good card. If you're defending from the get-go, never falling behind in life, then Awakening isn't useful. It just is what it is. It's not functional in that scenario. There's no such thing. Okay, I don't want to say there's no such thing. There's few things as just default very strong cards in Flesh and Blood. You are trying to find the best tools for your plan. And I think that's one of the things when I talk about the growth of Flesh and Blood, we're seeing more and more of this. If you go back to, early Flesh and Blood deck building, people played by default almost Fate Foreseen, Sink Below. They're really good cards. There's no question that D-Reacts that can block for 4 and cost 0 are incredibly strong. They're above rate and they're worth a lot. But not every plan wants them. If your plan is to be the aggressor, you don't want to dilute that plan with D-Reacts. And I felt like I was like banging my head against the wall saying this to people for a long time. But you look at the way lists are changing, and people are getting it now. I think we're seeing that evolution, and people are now building towards game plans as opposed to just playing the default good cards. And some of that is an expanding card pool, right? Like when you don't have that many good cards, the gap is greater. So as there's only a few sets in Flesh and Blood, I get why you're more incentivized to play things like Fate Foreseen, like Sink Below. But as time goes on, it's more and more about building game plans. And I think Michael Hamilton was just exhibit A for that.
It's fascinating to me also the fact that cards like Enlightened Strike and Command and Conquer, which were staples, they were build around cards. These were the coveted pieces that every collector wanted because of just how important they were to a multitude of different decks, are now just left in the dust. They're no longer even in the conversation for many decks that would have had them otherwise. And again, it's great to see, and new cards are going to be coming around the corner, and it'll be fascinating to see how those impact, because Everfest was one hell of a supercharger to the meta and to the decks that were already making waves. But there was one very important piece that occurred on the broadcast that a lot of people might not catch, was that I was finally somewhat defeated in a little game I like to play called 90s and 80s references, and who can come at me, because I, as a caster I've been casting many events for 4 or 5 years. My casting partners typically are either it's just over their head, or they cannot keep up with that little ping pong game that we go. So for those who are not aware, there was one game where I was just sitting across from Bryan, and we're chatting, and I believe it was like a second or third consecutive fuse by a Starvo player or something like that. And I said, I'm like, man, he's playing like Michael Jackson in the 80s, just hit after hit after hit. And you came back with, but if you're so and so, you've got to be starting something. And I was like, he's here to play. All right. And I believe that my response to that was, if you're so and so, the way you got to be looking across from the table and saying, the way you make me feel here is not too comfortable. And you came back, and this is where I was already incredibly impressed by you as a human being and a caster, but this is where you just solidified yourself in the Flake Hall of Fame, because you said something and you won the game, because you made a reference that I did not catch, and I want you to say it again, please, if you may.
So if I recall correctly, I actually don't think Starvo was involved. I think it was when we were covering Austin Yost versus Austin was on Viserai and was playing against a Lexi player. I think.
Yes, I think that it might have been that. I think so.
Because in my head, my response was, I think Austin is going to remember the time in this game where he made this decision.
Yes.
Of course, referencing Michael Jackson's Remember the Time from Dangerous, with that awesome video where he's like a pharaoh or something in Egypt, and just like this incredible gold outfit dancing around. You can catch it, Flake. You let it go right over your head.
Yeah, that one got me offhand, because in my head I was locked and loaded for some type of heal the world sort of mention or something along those lines.
I had like 40 more in my back pocket. I would have gone until the end of the broadcast. I was a huge Michael Jackson fan growing up. So.
And this is why, like I mentioned, it just the respect was already there, but you basically just dipped it in bronze and hung it on the wall. So it's yours forever, my friend. And that was something that I thought was pretty damn cool. And which really gets me eager to cast with you again because it was such an awesome experience from the get-go. For those who don't know, I had never met Bryan. I think we had spoken on Discord a couple times here and there, but I had never worked with Bryan, let alone met Bryan. And when I showed up at the venue, which again was kind of it was haphazard. It was not planned. The first thing that Bryan does is it just comes. He gets up from the booth and gives me a handshake and a big hug and says, "Dude, it's really awesome to meet you. We're gonna have a great time." I'm like, "Funk, yes, this is exactly the kind of human being that I want to hang out with." So I do appreciate that, and that's really top notch of you, my friend.
My pleasure, and I turned out to be right. So it all came to fruition like I saw it going. It was just. One of the best experiences I've had in the booth. We had such an easy, good time, such great games. It was an awesome weekend. And I said afterwards, I couldn't remember the last time I left doing coverage. And I love doing coverage. Every event I've ever done, not to say there's not trials and tribulations along the way, or they've all gone perfectly or smoothly, but in general, I leave an event and I'm like, I'm really glad I get to do this for a living. It's a cool thing to do. And I love gaming. I love games, and I'm so happy I get to share that with people. But I couldn't remember the last time I was like on such a high after a show where I was just like, man, we did a really good job with our circumstances, and we made this product look really good. Not that it needs all that much help, but I just think it was like, it felt like a real home run. And you get a lot of solid shows, but you don't get a lot of home runs in this business, I find.
Well, that's it. A lot of them are like doubles that you need two people you need someone to bunch you over and then sack fly you home, so to speak. You need to sort of cobble together a run in many cases, but this one was just one pitch and one swing, and it was gone the whole way through. I'm not one to really read reviews about this kind of stuff. I'm always open to constructive criticism, don't get me wrong, but the internet has this funny way of just not necessarily, jamming the constructive part into the criticism. But it seemed like it was well received by many, and I'm very happy about that, because a lot of people need to understand that the work that gets put in on everybody's side, be it production, be it casting, obviously the players are there and they put a lot of work in, but there was a lot of work that was put into this broadcast, and I'm glad that people appreciated it and understood that we put in the work, and it showed. So, like you mentioned, I was on an equal high, man. Driving home, I had an 8-hour drive from Indianapolis to Buffalo, and then an additional 2-hour drive from Buffalo to Toronto, and all I could do was just look back and say, "Damn, this was great," and the next one's going to be even better. So. Feels good, man.
Right there with you.
The next big thing that I want to dig into is the fact that you wrote a very, very well-articulated, well-argued piece, an article that we'll put in the description of this video, that you wrote a piece giving your arguments in favor of the exchange of Pro Tour invites. And this is a point of contention amongst a lot of people, both casual and professional, who look at this and say, wait a second, this is a Pro Tour invite. This is a very coveted ticket to the big show, essentially. How is it that this can just be purchased? Doesn't that seem unfair? But you did a very good job. And I know that this was something that was discussed amongst many people. And you eventually said, you know what, I could write this on Discord as an argument, but it's going to take me a load of time. This is probably something that many people need to hear, and I'm glad you did it, because the arguments that you put actually convinced me, and that's great. And but I want to dig into these. And basically, you're arguing that the exchange of PTIs, be it through buying or selling, is a perfectly fine thing. In fact, it's a great thing. And before we get into some of the nitty-gritty, can you just give us a little bit of an overhead view of why you believe that these are this is a good thing, and then we'll dig into some of the finer points about them.
Yeah, it really comes down to kind of 2 points, as I see it, the two most simple points I can make in favor of this. One, it's already happening in TCGs. People are already buying invites. It doesn't look like a direct exchange of here's my dollars for the invite, thank you. But there's all kinds of value maximization and, conceding in spots where it benefits your opponent, and you're not asking for anything, but you expect you're probably going to get something back. And I'm telling you, for decades in Magic, amongst the people in the know, this is common practice. You concede to people in spots where they benefit from it. It doesn't hurt you, and you maximize equity, and you assume on the back end it's all going to get straightened out. So this has all been going on anyway. Let's not pretend like it hasn't been. The second big point is that this actually serves multiple classes of players. And I would go as far as to say it serves everyone, because it brings more dollars into the economy of your game, which is good if you're trying to make a sustainable, endeavor of running your tournament series. It basically gives another cash equivalent item that is being stapled on to tournament prizes without LSS actually having to go into their pockets and produce that cash, which is a big deal, because I have seen many a TCG come along, be like, we have $1 million Pro Tour, and then they're dead the next year. Because you know why? They didn't make $1 million. They didn't have $1 million to give away. That's a lot of money to give away, especially when you're, a startup and trying to get people on board with your game and you have all these other costs. So it's just something I've seen time and time again. So having that more transferable good is beneficial. I detailed multiple classes of players, the busy professional who just can't do the PTQ grind, the person who really is not in a financial position to take on traveling for a Pro Tour, or the person who doesn't care about a Pro Tour. It's just not important to them. But you still want to have these people as part of your scene. They're the bedrock, the foundation of local competition, which will lead to all of these systems being perpetuated and growing over time. And it just seems incredibly savvy, incredibly smart, and also incredibly brave, quite frankly, because the instinct of most people to hearing you can buy a Pro Tour invite is going to be revulsion, myself included. I think you really have to stop yourself. You have to think through the policy and what's being accomplished with it and what the end results of it are going to be, to be able to accept it as ultimately good for the game.
And that's why people should read this article, is because like you mentioned, there was this complete initial revulsion. There was a knee-jerk reaction to just the thought of, wow, you can just buy your way into the big show. And to a degree, it's like, imagine just slamming down X amount of dollars to go and, hit cleanup for the Yankees, like to a degree, right? Obviously, that's the completely out of left field, pun intended, kind of anecdote there or comparison, but ultimately it kind of meets the same thing, is that you're basically buying your way, a shortcut into the biggest possible stage and level of competition. But at the same time, I've seen Billy Crystal, who is a huge Yankees fan, pay a lot of money and use a lot of his own influence and celebrity to take pitches and have an at-bat in an official Yankees spring training game. And what was the result of that? He fouled one ball off of a pitch and then struck out, and that was it. So this is where I think that people should definitely read your article, because it convinced me, and this is all off the basis of you yourself having your own initial reflection on it and coming to terms with the fact that this is not a bad thing. And you've definitely convinced me. There's a few points in this that I want to dig out, and I do encourage everyone out there to please go read this article by Bryan Gottlieb, and also go follow him at Bryan Go, at Bryan Go on Twitter, because you'll find all of his insights on this as well. But one of the major parts was the fact that you talk about how this is already occurring, and all this does is kind of take away some of that shadiness and that little secret handshake Illuminati style stuff of getting this all taken place and done. It's much akin to, in my opinion, it's like I live in Canada. Everybody was smoking weed outdoors, no problem. And if you just legalize it, nobody has to worry about it, because it's all happening anyways. And I know that's a weird comparison to make ultimately, but it's happening as it is, right? Like this is something that was occurring prior to the idea of exchanging PTIs.
Oh, and when these things often happen is when the thing you're trying to prevent isn't worth enforcing, because it ultimately won't make a difference. Now, does that mean there's no negative consequences of, we'll use either example. Let's talk about negative consequences of people smoking weed all the time. There's some. I mean, I think they're low, and in comparison to other things which we prohibit, they're certainly much lower. If alcohol is legal, I think weed should be legal. But there are consequences that, people can damage their lungs by smoking too much, or, it finances some things in other parts of the world that you would rather not finance, quite frankly, the global marijuana trade. So there are valid reasons you don't want these things to happen, but you can't solve them through laws. And I get the idea that we want a place where card games are decided solely on skill, and the dollar difference in my wallet versus your wallet doesn't even factor into who is going to win the match. And no matter where in the world you live, you're able to participate in Pro Tours on the same terms. It doesn't matter, what the state of your nation's economy is. If you're in a Pro Tour, you get to do the Pro Tour, and you don't have to worry about these things. You can't fix this stuff through the rules of your TCG, though. It's just not realistic. Like, you're not going to solve global economic inequity via TCG rules. And that's one of the biggest pushbacks I got after writing the article was, well, people in impoverished countries, they're just going to sell all these invites to the US. And I'm like, well, what were they doing before? Like, if this policy doesn't exist, then what are they doing in that spot? And then people would be like, well, if you look at tournaments in this place of the world, they were concession fest because most people didn't want the invite. And so they would concede and there would be payouts. And I'm like, yes, you're proving my point. This is exactly my point. So now instead, you actually get a valid tournament at these events, and these people get to play to conclusion. And just because you're in a position where maybe you can't, leverage this event, or you can't take the time off work to go travel to play a Pro Tour, you still can benefit from the prize of having the Pro Tour invite, and you get to make the decision. That's the most important thing, is you put the power in the hands of the player, and the player gets to go, yes, this is right for me. No, this is not right for me. And if you're going to say, well, in impoverished countries, then these PTIs are going to be worth too much, and they're going to be super incentivized to sell it in richer countries. Isn't that good? Like, it's not a solution, but isn't it good that these people have the option? If you can, have more comfort in your life because you chose not to attend a TCG tournament, and instead you traded that for 3 months of comfort and not worrying about where your next meal is coming from. Awesome. I wish I could do so much more with TCGs. I wish I could make sure that nobody ever had to deal with food uncertainty or homelessness or anything like that, but that's outside the scope of a TCG. So just give people as many tools as you possibly can to deal with their circumstances as they see fit. That's the point I keep coming back to, is just put the power in the hands of the player. And I think it's incredibly player friendly of LSS to say, you make the decision. We're not going to enforce this upon you. Because if you win a Magic Pro Tour invite, go to that Pro Tour, it's dead. There's nothing to take back from that. And, a lot of times they'll make exceptions for emergencies, but sometimes they won't. And it has to be an emergency that they deem, of a sufficient level to transfer your event status elsewhere. So I just think it's so disingenuous to say this does anything other than give players more choice, more freedom. And like, you don't know me that well. I am the furthest thing from like a defender of the free market and being like, yeah, we'll just let capitalism sort it out. That's not my MO whatsoever. It's the exact opposite, I would say. But sometimes you just let these things resolve themselves, and it ends up being net better for all the participants involved. And when the choice is like, well, do I want to give people who are a little bit more wealthy power in the situation, or do I want to give the power to the corporation to make the decision? Even in the case of a corporation which has generally proven themselves to be thoughtful and player friendly and good, like LSS, I still say put the power in the hands of the player. It's just better. It's better for all of us participating, and it's a concession on the part of the company that it makes me want to support them more, quite frankly.
And I think that there's a certain aspect here where LSS might be leaning more towards the realism of many people's circumstances versus the ideal circumstances, which are, okay, everybody who wins will be there because they can be there, and there's nothing else in the world that's going on, and they have no other use for that particular PTI. The fact that you can kind of flip it for, like you mentioned, maybe you're flipping it for 3 months of rent. And you know what? That is enormous, because that's something that I would do. I mean, I sold my gold foil that I got.
It's stuff I've done. Flake. And that's the other thing. I wonder how many people who are upset about it, were ever poor. I grew up very poor with almost nothing. And it influenced the way I participated in TCGs. It influences every part of your life. It seeps into absolutely everything. And when you're in desperate survival situations, you want choices. You want options. You need that flexibility to be able to survive. And I just think some people miss that point.
I think part of the realism is also the fact that financial inequality does not necessarily end at the fact that I could buy cards and you can't. There's so much more. And this is a very important part that I absolutely adored that you brought up in your article, because you really flesh out so many of the subtle little inequalities, those little, chasms between what a wealthy player or somebody who has the means to just have everything in their ideal state so that they can perform at the level that they want versus those who don't have those luxuries. And I know this because I am looking at this thing right here, and I'm checking off aspects that I have access to, that I wish I had access to, and I'm like, holy Moses! I'm like, there's so many extra layers. Things like you mentioned, time off work. I have the luxury of doing that because my work is this game. But coaching, how many people are out there to not only have access to a good coach, but if that coach is charging, which a lot of coaches do, that's part of it. Deck lists are a different story. I mean, you can get those fairly freewheeling deal, but a lot of them, as you mentioned in this article, are hidden behind paywalls on like Patreons and stuff. And this one got me so dead set. Your own hotel for a better night's sleep, because there are times, man, where you choose the wrong roommate and they're sawing logs like they're building another Bryan Gottlieb mahogany fortress that you're in right now, apparently. Like, that's kind of what's going on in a lot of these, and that's what this is. And, this inequality of what people have and don't have, sometimes picking up a PTI that's the end game. The end game is like this, because I can't go to the Pro Tour. I have way too much other stuff that I got to do. So this is legitimately the trophy that I'm going to get, is selling this for $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever the going rate is. I've heard all the way up to 2,000 USD is what some people are asking for these. But that level of inequality from a financial aspect, you do a really good job in this article of just shaking that stigma that it goes beyond just having all the Majestics and legendary equipment that you need.
Yeah, but that's still a threshold issue, right? Like, there's so many issues where money gives you an advantage over someone who doesn't have money, that it's painful, it's unfortunate. I hate it. Like, I've spent a large portion of my life, one, dealing with it. Two, we go to my professional life, and I worked for, as a lawyer, I worked for impoverished clients trying to remain in their homes. I did foreclosure prevention, and I took a 85% pay cut to go do that. And I did so happily because I wanted to help people deal with this income inequality. Like, it's something that is very, very present in my past life, in my present life, and I'm sure will be part of my future life, because it does have such a dramatic impact on people's existence. And that's my whole MO, is like, I just want people to have more, to be safe, to be happy. Like, that influences the vast majority of decisions I make in my life. And I recognize there's not always great ways to do that. So you have to take like half measures and small measures to make things a little bit better. Because like I said, you can't solve global economic inequity through your TCG. It's just not realistic. And I would rather players have freedom than try and shoehorn them into this box that just isn't going to work for everyone.
Yeah, like we mentioned, the ideal versus the reality are completely different things, and you can always sort of strive for this ideal picture of what you want things to look like, but ultimately that's not the truth. It's just not. It's not the way it is. One of the most difficult aspects of this whole concept of exchanging PTIs that I had the most trouble coming to terms with was the level of competition, and that would essentially be at these tournaments, even if it was a dozen players out of the field of I don't know how many in total, but out of this massive field of the world's best players, how many of them are, how diluted is the pool typically if you're not getting the best in the out there? And you do another good job here of articulating the fact that the players that are buying these PTIs are either players that, are good enough to have won them and maybe just crapped out in certain areas or didn't have the opportunity. Those are the players that are going to be forking up because they feel like they're going to actually get the job done, that they will be a threat. And on the other hand, maybe it is just some whale that has got an extra grand in their pocket that says, you know what, I'm here for the experience. I want to be part of this team. But they're going to go 0-2. And then that's the end of the story. They'll never see a sniff of anything in terms of making waves. Can you just elaborate a little bit more about what type of player is looking for to buy these PTIs?
Well, so in my article, I gave my own story of being a player on the Magic Pro Tour, where my for folks who don't know my Magic background, I was never like a regular on the Pro Tour. Some of that was circumstances I mentioned previously, like not having a lot of money. Before I went to law school, I worked as a bartender. You make all your money as a bartender on the weekends. I couldn't afford to take off weekends, and I was living, not even paycheck to paycheck, because you don't get paychecks as a bartender. I was living night to night. I needed my tips to go ahead and pay my rent and have a place to live. So that kept me away from the Magic PTQ scene for a very long time. And even despite that, I would have moments where I showed up on a Pro Tour here, a Pro Tour there, GP top 8 here, and I did well, but I was never a fixture on the scene. And oddly enough, the moment when I kind of put together my best run was a moment where I had zero free time. I was working as a lawyer in New York City, just doing asinine hours, like every single day, most weekends. Even if I had the day off, I was expected to answer my phone and just be ready to put in 8 hours at a moment's notice. So no real freedom whatsoever, just working all the time. And I happened to finally, this was actually my first weekend I had taken off from work since I started at the law firm, and I went to GP for Magic, which is the equivalent of a calling, basically. And I top forward without having seen many of the cards before, because I was so busy I didn't have time to look at them, but was able to play well enough to make a top 4. And then that sent me to the next Pro Tour, where I again took some time off, basically at this point knowing that like I didn't want to remain at this law firm forever. I wasn't trying to make a career out of it, because taking the time off basically identified me as someone who like wasn't a lifer and wasn't ever going to be on the partner track. And I, at this point, was very cool with that, and went and played this Pro Tour and narrowly missed the Pro Tour top 8, losing 3 win-ins. And then that was good enough to play the next Pro Tour. And then I did very well at that Pro Tour, but not well enough to qualify for the next one. And in this time, I'm not playing any PTQs because I still don't have time. I'm basically practicing for these events, riding the subway, playing games against myself, because I can't go to the store. I don't have time for like Magic Online. I'm just trying to, in the very limited time I have, learn as much as possible. And I'm still doing really well. But I get to this point where my invites run out, and that's it for me. I'm done. And in Magic, we would accumulate pro points throughout a season. And if you get a certain threshold, then you get multiple invites and you're invited to more and more stuff. And it's called the train. So you get the train rolling and you stay on and you play professional Magic for a few years oftentimes. But in my peak playing prowess, with basically mountains of evidence that I was good enough to be here, I deserved a slot to be here, I could compete at this level, I just had to walk away. And I had no other option. So would I have bought a Pro Tour invite in that spot? Absolutely. In a second, I would have bought it. And I would have proven my worth on the tour having bought that Pro Tour invite. And I think that's a lot of what you're going to see. And in fact, one of the first responses I got to my article was from someone who had 7 ProQuest top 8s. Didn't convert. Finished second in one, and obviously these 6 others, but didn't get the job done. Do you think that person is good enough to play on the Pro Tour? Hell yeah, they are. They absolutely are. And it's just a little bit of variance here, a little bit of variance there. Things break different, and maybe they win 7 ProQuests instead. And that's the person we're all talking about heading in to the Pro Tour. So I think it's going to be way more of that than just the tourists. But ultimately, it doesn't matter which one shows up, because the problem takes care of itself. If they're not good enough to be there, they'll lose. If they are, they'll show they would have gotten there anyway.
That's a good way to look at it, absolutely. And I think that everybody who is still on the fence, obviously we've discussed a lot about what's in that article, but there's still so much for you guys to go ahead and dig into. Bryan's article, which is, if I can get the title correctly here, it's on arenadecklist.gg. That's, I believe, your website with a lot of your content there, so go check that out. The title of the article is Selling Pro Tour Slots, the Best Feature of Flesh and Blood OP. So please, ladies and gentlemen, go find that and get, fill in the missing pieces. And I promise you, I myself was somebody who was completely against this. I thought that it was a little bit of a slap in the face to the competitive integrity of the tournament. However, the way that Bryan has essentially angled this and chopped it up into these very digestible pieces is incredible in terms of, I'm convinced. And I'm somebody, I wouldn't say I'm stubborn, but I'm always open to, shifting gears, and this is certainly one of those times. So well done on this article, Bryan, again, and I recommend that everybody takes a look at it for sure.
Thank you. And I appreciate you giving me a chance to change your mind, because I think the instinct is to dig your heels in, right? But I am pleasantly surprised by how many people in the Flesh and Blood community have just been like, no, I didn't feel this way, but I gave your article a chance, and now I agree with you. So that's been really nice to hear.
Well, there's nothing wrong with digging in your heels if you've heard arguments. Like the thing about digging in your heels is that you got to leave the gate open for the arguments to come through. And the worst thing that happens is you hear the arguments, you consider them, and it only strengthens your prior convictions about something, because people might read those arguments and still say that, you know what, like, you make good points, but this doesn't change my mind. And that's perfectly fine as well and valid. But the important part is being open to that dialogue and that discussion, which you do an excellent job of bringing to the table, Mr. Bryan Gottlieb. Now, you did mention that, hey, you said, hey, Flake, I know you don't know me too well, but we're going to change that, because the next segment is called Go Again, Mr. Bryan, and we've got 8 questions ready to go. So will you join us for Go Again?
Absolutely. I am activating my Spellbound Creepers. I'm going to go ahead and throw Moth Skies out there, and I'm going to get my Go Again.
I love it. I will try to block as much arcane damage as possible so those Spellbound Creepers go and bite it. We will be
Good plan.
Right back, ladies and gentlemen, with our Go Again segment with Bryan Gottlieb. But first, again, this has been brought to you by Fabdb.net, and we got a brief but awesome product review from BCW Supplies. Don't go too far. Today's episode, as always, is brought to you by BCW Supplies. So check out bcwsupplies.com and use the code ISP10 to get 10% off all of your orders. Not just the first one. So order often, order soon. Today we're going to feature the Spectrum Prism deck box. This is brand new from BCW, and it is the Prism deck box, which is kind of fitting given the fact that I've had a lot of reps with Prism as a hero lately. So here's what it looks like. It comes in a myriad of different colors. I've got a blue one sealed up over here. I also got this beautiful purple one. So what is the Prism deck box? It's a very clean, smooth, and rounded edge sheer corner that holds a deck of 100 sleeved cards. Now, the beautiful part about this is that it is just very, very clean and smooth and just looks gorgeous. It has a very soft and, supple edges, if I may say. But the beautiful part about it is the fact that it's going to hold your deck in here. That's a blackout kick, and that is a Zen state. There's a lot of cards in here, but ultimately, the beautiful part about this thing is that it's so concise. It's very minimalistic in terms of what it wants to do, but what it wants to do is hold your cards, and it does it well. So you jam your cards into the deck box like so. It'll hold 100. Now, this is just my 80 that I would play. This is my Ninja list, so you got still another spot here to put your other 20 if you're going for 100. The top slides on. It clips together like that, and then hello. It is absolutely freaking secure. That is what you want. This is the Prism Spectrum deck box from BCW Supplies. So check it out. The Spectrum series, the Prism, it is a gorgeous thing. We got blue, purple, I've seen black. I forgot what other colors, but ultimately, check it out. Use the code ISP10. Get yours today. Get 10% off with the code ISP10. Support the channel. Support BCW. Check it out. All right, it's time to go wide on Bryan Gottlieb. We're going to hit him with a series of rapid-fire questions. This is the Go Again segment. I've got 8 questions lined up for you, Mr. Bryan. Are you ready, sir?
Yeah, the only thing I'm scared about is brevity. That's not my strong suit, Flake. I don't know if you noticed that by now. I kind of pop off sometimes.
Oh, please. We've cast together already where I'm sure that if it was left to us, we would have been on this tangent rocket ship of 90s references that... discipline is important, but this is at least a free space. This is a creative zone.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
All right, number 1, this is my favorite question to ask people, possibly second favorite. What is Bryan Gottlieb's hidden talent?
I don't really keep anything hidden. Like, I kind of am an open book a lot of the time. I am very good at cooking various Asian dishes. I spend a lot of time studying Asian cuisine and make a lot of nice stuff, I think.
Well, that is always good to hear as somebody who is lover of Thai noodles, like spicy noodles are my favorite.
I just actually made spicy noodles for lunch today.
You beautiful man. Oh, God. I am going to join your Mahogany Fortress at one point, and I see some guitars there, so we'll jam out as well.
Absolutely.
Next question. This is from some random scrub by the name of Hayden Dale, a.k.a. champion Hayden Dale, aka Awesome Human Being Hayden Dale of Arsenal Pass, asking, do you think we are in for some surprises when it comes to the Pro Tour #1? Maybe an unknown player rising to the occasion, a hero we have written off, shocking the field, or a metagame that looks solved but maybe isn't?
I think a lot of that depends on this upcoming banned and restricted announcement, quite frankly. I do think there is some very pointed information that Bravo is better than everything else. And I think once you distill that information through the Pro Tour filter, I think it would be a heavily Bravo slanted field, both Bravo and anti-Bravo. So in the absence of any changes there, I think the metagame itself will remain a lot of what we've seen thus far. As far as the strategies within that metagame, they could be night and day. I mean, I think it's very possible that these decks shift their focus. You know, it's also possible that Bravo goes too far in accounting for the mirror. If you believe it's going to be nothing but Bravos and you push too far in that direction, maybe there are some weaknesses to other options. So I'm not ruling out wild things happening. I do think the meta is at a pretty stable place, a pretty soft place for the most part. As far as players, I think it's absolutely possible that a player can come out of nowhere, because I think you're going to see some players really get to put in their first hard effort. You know, a lot of people are good enough to win their PTIs on just raw talent, quite frankly. But what happens when those people who are just leveraging talent start to put in the reps as well and start to come up with new plans and start to explore things that haven't been explored? I think that's going to be the really interesting thing to see.
I think out of that, I mean, based on the conversation we had in the other segment, being that, you know, maybe an unknown player rising to the occasion, wouldn't it be a story if the final was somebody who, you know, was a calling champion or a national champion versus somebody who bought their way into the tournament? Wouldn't that be a story?
I think that's an awesome story. I think that's like so cool. And you can, to an extent that like everyone is comfortable with, you could set up good guy versus bad guy if you want. And I think like that's an important part of making TCGs appealing, is having those narratives running through everything. So I would be all for that.
Yeah, the champion versus the sellsword, kind of that whole narrative. I like
Absolutely.
it. This one coming in from, the pronunciation on this is always confusing to me. It's either Drunks or Dr. Unks, otherwise on Twitter, asking, when do you move to New Zealand to work for Legend Story Studios?
I will quote a fellow Canadian of yours, Blake, one of my favorite humans in the world, and I'll just say never say never. That's the way I live my life. Never say never.
All right, I like it. That's not a bad idea. I mean, out of all I love Canada. I'm very patriotic. I love my country very much. But on the short list of places that I would go if I were ever to move, I think New Zealand is actually on there. And that a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm within grabbing range of the extended edition of Lord of the Rings. But I know that place is a lot more than just the Shire.
Heard great things.
Next question from Raman Putra asking, what's your favorite deck in Flesh and Blood right now and why? And asking both Blitz and Classic Constructed.
In Blitz, I'm playing a lot of Oldhim. I tend towards Guardians anyway, but also I get to fire up my pick for the best card in Everfest, besides Bravo. I'm kind of not counting that. Earthlore Bounty, and I play Tome of Harvest, Earthlore Bounty in my Oldhim deck. Nobody else does that. I also played it in my Bravo Star of the Show deck. Nobody else did that. I still kind of, sort of, maybe think I'm right. I think I'm more right when it comes to Oldhim, because you're not necessarily giving up Crown of Seeds Tunic, because you don't really want Tunic as Oldhim anyway. You prefer something a little bit more defensive in Blitz. So, you know, we have our 2 Temper from Earthlore Bounty, and those turns where you fuel up your Guardian attacks, of which you have many in Oldhim, are really powerful. So that's what I'm playing in Blitz right now. In Constructed, I was a Starvo guy for sure. I'm certainly more focused on Blitz given Skirmish season and our local scene starting to take off, which I'm really excited about. But if I had to play a CC tournament right now and I wasn't necessarily hyper focused on the outcome, I'd probably play a little Viscerai. I love Viscerai. I'm just not good enough to win with it in most instances.
It's just fascinating because they're completely different types of heroes. The one's a very aggressive, the other's a very defensive kind of fatigue, and well, there you go. That's your answer, Ramen.
One of the things I love about Flesh and Blood is that I love playing all the playstyles. Like I think they all offer something. They all lead to interesting games. So I would say I'm diverse in my choice of heroes.
This is a very important question, partially because this might influence my choices this evening. But what toppings go on Bryan Gottlieb's ideal pizza?
Well, I'm a vegetarian. I have been for like 5 years now. So all the meats are out. In general, I do a lot of mushroom, just straight up mushroom. I love mushroom pizza. But like a nice trio of onions, peppers, and mushrooms, that's a real banger for me as well.
You basically create that is essentially the foundation for me. I like to throw like spicy sausage on there as well, but for me it's mushroom, onion, hot pepper, and sausage. Like that to me is so, we can I'm good with the no sausage because I like I like the heat and the crispiness.
Maybe I could talk you into a plant-based sausage. There's good alternatives out there. Okay, yeah, we'll give that a shot.
Dude, listen, I'm very much, as long as there's no olives on that bad boy, then we're good.
Olives are not coming anywhere near my pizza. Don't worry about that.
Bryan, Matt, where have you been all my life? Buddy.
Olives.
Love it. All right. Next one coming in from David Rude, asking, have you considered purchasing a PTI to play a PT you are not doing coverage for? And another question would be, do you think Flesh and Blood is better or worse to do live coverage on than Magic the Gathering?
I love both these questions. I considered buying a PTI for this Pro Tour. Ultimately, I just want to be there. And I think I'd actually prefer to watch more than I would play. I want to be around. I want to be following the stories. I want to be part of the atmosphere. And if I were to play, I'd be cool with it. But ultimately, it's not super important to me, so I'm not going to spend the money on it. It's just more important to me that I be there, and I will be there, absolutely. And I can't wait. I'm super stoked about it. As far as which is better to cover,
tread lightly, my friend. Yeah, tread lightly.
No, I know that. Just going to be frank. I'm always honest about this stuff.
That's what I say. You're unapologetically honest about things, which is it scores major respect points across the board always. So, and I know that you've got a gift of just articulating things and making them seem real nice. So hit me with it.
Well, so right now, Magic is the better game to cover. That is based mostly on history, tradition, backstories, narratives around the players, people having identified with their favorite players. Those things are all very easy to drive intriguing coverage out of. And if you followed my work on the SCG Tour, you know how important that was to us in terms of telling narratives and making sure we had the same people featured all the time and really getting people the chance to get to know these players and form bonds with them. Now, a lot of those bonds have faded over the pandemic. Magic is having weird issues right now, quite frankly. But I still think it's got enough history, enough of that in the bank, where at this moment, it is the better game for coverage. In terms of ceiling, I think Flesh and Blood ceiling is way higher. And the reason for that is because actual games of Flesh and Blood. So we ignore this narrative stuff. And like I said, I think it's a key part of the broadcast. And that's why I'm giving the edge to Magic right now. You can't ignore it. It's critical to make your broadcast intriguing. But there's still the games to talk about. And games of Flesh and Blood are so much more interesting than the vast majority of Magic games. There are really good Magic games. Don't get me wrong. There's really intriguing Magic games. But every Flesh and Blood game is very good. Every Flesh and Blood game is intriguing. Everyone has those moments. And that's not true of Magic. There's games that are just one-sided, aren't all that interesting. There's games that are non-games, quite frankly. They aren't even competitive. And that's just part of the game. And it's a feature. It's not a bug. It's the way Magic is designed. And, there's something to be said for that being potentially a problem with Flesh and Blood. The fact that there aren't those non-games, so you don't have as much of an opportunity for an underdog to defeat a better player in as many scenarios like they can in Magic. Again, that's another important part of the narrative. But ultimately, in terms of the quality of the games, Flesh and Blood is just so good. Everything is so tense. I mean, you felt it, Flake. We felt it in the booth. We didn't cover bad games. It didn't happen. Like, our weakest game was probably the semifinals, where it was Sam Dando versus Michael Hamilton, and just Sam isn't able to get his thing going. It just doesn't happen for the Briar side. But actually, there's a bunch of really tense turns where if Sam hits, then the game snowballs very quickly. And that was the worst of our games, and it was still very, very interesting. The other ones, they came down to one life every time, every single time. And everyone had like exciting moments and incredible decision points. So I think the ceiling is sky high on Flesh and Blood. And I think in terms of the actual games being played, it is better than Magic.
I've watched so many different Magic events and just following names, and I'm not so plugged into that community or that game. I've never really been involved from a broadcast perspective, nor have I been as a player perspective from a competition. But watching those and knowing some of the names and realizing that this player is a good player, this and that, and seeing those narratives being created and nourished and evolve over time, even as a casual, I was very enthralled. Much like watching. I hate always harping back on this, but watching, a wrestling match, it's like you recognize the names, you know that there's history, you know that you understand the turmoil, the struggle prior to that. The narratives were already there. They just got watered over time. I feel like the seeds for that are being planted right now when you have players like Michael Hamilton going back, winning 2 callings. The heroes are being assessed. The quote unquote, the heels of the business are also sort of out there and establishing themselves to a degree. It's starting, and I like what you're saying, and the candid nature of that response, and I would tend to agree with, because what draws people in, I find, is some reliability and familiarity of the personalities involved from a player perspective, and you can't touch Magic on that right now because those players are still out there blazing trails and making waves, and with new players out there to challenge them. Flesh and Blood doesn't have that luxury of time at its back, but it does ahead of it. So I think that a steady foot can really ramp that up. So
I think it's already turning, Blake. Like if we were to sit down tomorrow and get a Tariq Patel versus Michael Hamilton match to see who the best player in NA is, like that's now fascinating. Whereas you go back prior to this calling, people in the know certainly would have known. I think Tariq's, name kind of pushed a little further than Michael's until this past calling. But people in the know would have known that was a good matchup. But now it's starting to get that momentum behind it. The narratives are starting to build behind it. And it's only up from here. The more we build these things, the more intense these showdowns are going to be.
It's crazy because there was essentially this exchange of titles, as it were, as Matt Rogers, the previous world number 1, was overtaken by Michael Hamilton based on his win at the Calling. And what's incredible about that is it's like the belt going from the heel to the face, because everyone's really round. Not that people don't like Matt Rogers, but sometimes just the longevity that someone holds something creates that disdain, and people are clamoring. They're more celebrating the change than they are the person who's holding that title. And right now, Michael Hamilton is on top of the world at number 1. But there's also these droves of people who are supporting him because of how humble he is, because of how different his approach was, of how unique he is, and just how steadfast his game plan was. So I love seeing that, and I think you're absolutely correct that it's closer than people think. And
right.
And then,
but what's going to happen, Flake? What's going to happen the next time Michael Hamilton and Matt Rogers come together, where Michael Hamilton's now number 1 in the world? Are we going to look at like a Hogan Rock at WrestleMania situation where we're supposed to be rooting for this guy, but there's this old vet, right? And just one more run at the top, and you kind of want to see it, and all of a sudden the crowd changes like that. Like all of these things have so much potential to develop over time. And I think Flesh and Blood, like Magic kind of stumbled into a lot of the things that Flesh and Blood has done purposefully early on. And that's not a knock on Magic. It's just we're bringing a lot of people over from Magic. Like we know what works now. We know how you build these things. And, the folks from LSS themselves, most of them come from Magic backgrounds, and they are able to leverage all this knowledge we've built over 20 plus years and just hit the ground running with it. And I think they're doing a really good job.
They're doing an excellent job. And the future looks bright for sure. And this is another question regarding that particular future. This one's coming from BrewTapCast on Twitter, thinking on the future of Flesh and Blood and know about your background in card games. What would be the red flag to make you panic about Flesh and Blood's longevity?
I think there's 2 for me right now. I mean, they exist right now. And again, just honesty. I love this game so much, but there are 2 points of concern I have. The first is, how are we onboarding new players? I think that has to be a point of concern for Flesh and Blood, because you need to keep bringing people in. And the game is hard, it's complicated, it's low variance. So it's going to be harder to get people in the door if they're just showing up and losing all the time. It just is what it is. Like, that's how it works. And that's one of the things Magic does well, is it gives the new player the chance to beat the experienced player and, get the ball rolling for them. So there's some onboarding concerns I have. That also relates to the casual play experience. Like, if there's a casual route for those people to find their footing and then come up into the competitive scene, that works as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be, competitive, get beat up really bad for a while and then just fall out of the scene. There's other inroads as well. And I think LSS is very aware of that. Just all the buzz, all the talk around, like, finding the multiplayer format as it is. I think that's important to them, and they are working to deliver on that, but they have to deliver on it. I think it's an important part of their longevity. The other thing I'll point out, I mentioned these games that came along and just spent a lot of money on organized play right off the bat and kind of ran themselves into the ground. I don't know what LSS's bottom line looks like. I get the sense that things are going very well for them, and probably better than they expected them to do. And I think that is probably financing a lot of this early organized play stuff more than they're putting themselves out there on like a financial ledge for it. I don't know that, though. So I do see a lot of money being spent, and that's mostly a loss leader. Like, you're not going to get immediate return on building up your pro scene, on, making competitive play something to endeavor towards. That there's no immediate return there. I do think it's critical if you want a long and successful life as part of this business. If you're talking a 20-year run, a 30-year run, you're not doing that unless you have the legitimacy of competitive play behind your product. So I think it's smart to take that loss, but you have to be very judicious about it. Some of the things LSS does points me to the direction that they are being judicious. Things like using cold foils and gold foils to offset the costs of your OP. Really smart. You print those out of thin air, they cost you a few cents, and you have $1,000 prize to give out. You have to be careful. We all know there's like a limited amount of gold foils you could produce before they kind of lose their value very quickly. So you have to manage this well. You have to do the thing with the PTI as well and make sure you don't, alienate a bunch of your player base who doesn't take the time to read my article and understand that it's actually a good thing. So all of these things are fraught with peril. On the whole, though, LSS has done a tremendous job managing this stuff. I believe in Flesh and Blood. I think it's going to have a long run. I think it's just better than all but one TCG I've ever played in my life. And honestly, I like playing Flesh and Blood more than I like playing Magic right now. And it's not really all that close, quite frankly. So maybe, 10 years from now, I'm just saying actually Flesh and Blood is the better TCG. I wouldn't say that now. There's too much history, too much innovation in Magic's pocket. But could I see Flesh and Blood challenging for that one day? Absolutely. I don't see why not.
All right, let me set the stage for you here. You've decided that you want to compete in a major tournament. You've got your PTI in your pocket, as it were, but it might not even be that situation, because I have this idea for a tournament that I want to pitch to LSS, perhaps maybe for something late in the year. But this, as it would be, it's your turn. It's your turn for the feature match. All right, the crowds are out there. They're watching. They're waiting. You're an underdog, as it were. The stage is set. The table's ready. All of a sudden, the lights go down. It's time for you to walk out. What music just gets put onto 11 as you're making your way to the stage?
Prayers for Rain by The Cure. That will always be my entrance music. It's weird. It's creepy. I could see like the fog machines working overtime. Probably have like a hood pulled down over my head, get it real low like that and look all ominous as I come out. And then, the first chorus kicks in and you just kind of do the AJ Styles, flip it back. That's my entrance vibe right there. Little gothic, little creepy. And then, I'll find a deck that suits that whole MO, and that's what we'll be playing.
Maybe the new Necromancer hero that I've decided is probably going to be a thing that I would love to see.
That would fit very, very well with that entrance music.
That is awesome. My man, this has been probably one of my favorite, don't tell Tan and Grace, but this has been easily my favorite, one of my favorite interviews that I've done for this podcast. You are an all-star, my man, and I've told you this before, but it was a true pleasure to meet you, and too bad you're my friend now, so there's no going back.
I'll accept that. As long as you are willing to kind of buffer me from Tannen a little bit, I think we'll have a long and fruitful relationship and get along very well.
Yeah, we will quarantine you from Tannen. We don't need any of that influence kind of, just cramping our styles, as it were. But
right.
For all those out there who do not know Bryan Gottlieb or want more Bryan Gottlieb, such as that incredible article that he wrote, please, Bryan, enlighten the masses in terms of where they can get more Bryan Gottlieb.
Yeah, I basically in 3 places right now consistently. I'm on Twitter at BryanGo, BryanGo. I am writing for my own website over at arenadecklist.gg. And I also do my weekly podcast, Arena Decklist. It's the Arena Decklist podcast. You can find that on any of your platforms, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you want to look for a podcast. We're probably there. And those are my main avenues right now. Maybe occasionally Twitch. Don't count on that, though. I'm very flaky when it comes to Twitch.
Hey, as am I, but that's just part of my branding.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
I have to be. But again, thank you so much, Bryan, for doing the show. Ladies and gentlemen, another big thank you to our sponsors at Fabdb.net, your premier source for deck building tools and collection management, as well as BCW Supplies. Thanks for hooking us up. And to our patrons over at Patreon, you guys are awesome. So big ups to you guys. Thank you for keeping us afloat and just tossing your support. Like I said, we'll never hide anything. No content behind paywalls, but if you do want to just buy me a coffee every month, that's the best way that you can go out there and just pat us on the back. So friends, don't forget, you're not losing if you're learning. Keep shuffling the cards and play the game. You might win. We'll catch you next week on the Instant Speed Podcast.
Well,